Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to gently ask one small thing. If you truly enjoy these calm historical stories I make, it would mean a lot if you left a like, and perhaps shared where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It helps others discover these peaceful journeys, and I'm always humbled to see how far they travel across the world. Rome, in the year 121 of the Common Era, was a city of whispers and wonder. The early morning light would spill across terracotta rooftops, painting the city in shades of amber and rose. In these quiet hours, before the streets filled with the sounds of daily commerce, the city seemed to hold its breath, as if remembering all the centuries it had already witnessed, and all the stories yet to be told. It was in this Rome, this eternal city of dreams and marble, that a child was born. His name was Marcus Aurelius Verus, though history would come to know him by another name entirely. He arrived into a world of privilege, born into a patrician family, with roots that reached deep into Roman nobility. His father, Marcus Aurelius Verus the Elder, was a man of standing and respect, while his mother, Domitia Lucilla, came from a family of considerable wealth and influence. But titles and lineage, important as they were in Rome, tell us little of the boy himself. Picture, if you will, a child with thoughtful eyes, the kind of child who would pause to watch the play of light through a colonnade, or who would sit quietly in a garden while others rushed about. Even in his earliest years, there was something contemplative about young Marcus, something that suggested he would grow into someone unusual. The household where he spent his childhood was filled with the soft rustling of papyrus scrolls, the gentle conversations of educated men and women, and the warm Mediterranean light that filtered through draped doorways. His family's home, like many wealthy Roman residences, was built around a peaceful courtyard where fountains murmured their endless song and potted plants swayed in the gentle breeze. Here, young Marcus would sit cross-legged on cool stone, listening to the adults discuss philosophy, politics, and the great questions that occupied Roman minds. His father passed away when Marcus was still very young, a loss that might have broken a different child. But even in grief, there was something resilient in Marcus, something that bent rather than broke. His grandfather, another Marcus Aurelius Verus, stepped forward to guide the boy's upbringing, and under this gentle patriarch's care, young Marcus began to develop the qualities that would later define him. The Rome of Marcus's childhood was a place of remarkable peace and prosperity. The empire stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, from the rocky coasts of Hispania to the ancient lands of Syria. Trade flowed along well-maintained roads, bringing silk from distant China, spices from India, and ideas from every corner of the known world. It was the age of what historians would later call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and for those living within the empire's embrace, it must have seemed as though this golden age would last forever. But young Marcus, even as a child, seemed to understand something that others missed. He understood that peace was not the absence of struggle, but rather the careful cultivation of wisdom and restraint. He saw how his grandfather handled disputes with fairness, how his mother managed her estates with both firmness and compassion, and these lessons sank deep into his developing character. He was educated, as all wealthy Roman boys were, by a succession of tutors. But where other children might have chafed under the discipline of study, Marcus seemed to thrive. He learned Greek, for Greek was the language of philosophy and culture. He studied rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively, though he would never use this skill to dominate others, but rather to express truth clearly. He read Homer and Hesiod, Plato and Aristotle, letting their words wash over him like gentle rain on fertile soil. There was one particular tutor, a man named Diognetus, who taught Marcus to question appearances and seek truth beneath the surface. It was Diognetus who first introduced the boy to philosophy, not as an abstract academic pursuit, but as a way of living, a method for navigating the complexities of human existence with grace and wisdom. The old teacher would walk with young Marcus through gardens and along quiet paths, talking softly about the nature of virtue, the importance of self-examination, and the value of living in accordance with nature. Marcus listened with the kind of attention that is rare at any age, but especially so in youth. He absorbed these lessons not just with his mind, but with his whole being. Philosophy, for Marcus, was never merely theoretical. It was practical, immediate, and necessary. It was the toolkit he would use to build a meaningful life. As he grew from child to young man, Marcus developed habits that would stay with him throughout his life. He rose early, often before dawn, to study and reflect. He practiced simplicity, even though his family's wealth could have afforded him any luxury. He was, by all accounts, a serious youth, though not without warmth or humor. Those who knew him spoke of his kindness, his consideration for others, and his unusual maturity. The Rome around him continued its daily rhythms. In the Forum, orators debated and merchants haggled. In the Colosseum, spectacles were held that Marcus, even as a boy, found distasteful, preferring the quiet contemplation of a book to the roar of crowds. In the temples, priests made offerings to gods both old and new, while in private homes, families like Marcus's quietly explored the philosophical traditions that offered an alternative path to understanding the divine. At night, when the city grew quiet and the stars emerged above the 7 hills, young Marcus would sometimes stand on his family's terrace, looking out across the darkened rooftops toward the distant horizon. What did he think about in those moments? Perhaps he wondered about the vastness of the empire he could not yet imagine he would one day rule. Perhaps he thought about the nature of time, and how the same stars he watched had been watched by countless generations before him. Or perhaps he simply let his mind rest in the peaceful darkness, finding in the night's stillness a kind of truth that daylight sometimes obscured. The seasons turned, as they always do. Spring brought warm rains that made the gardens bloom. Summer brought heat that sent families to their country estates, where the air was cooler. Autumn brought the grape harvest and the olive pressing. Winter brought shorter days and longer evenings around the hearth. And through it all, Marcus grew, not just in height and years, but in wisdom and understanding. There was no way for the young man to know, of course, that his life was about to take a remarkable turn. There was no way to foresee that the gentle, studious boy who preferred books to games would one day wear the imperial purple. Fate, or fortune, or the gods themselves, call it what you will, had already set in motion the events that would transform Marcus Annius Verus into Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and emperor. But that transformation was still to come. For now he was simply a young man, learning to navigate the world with thoughtfulness and care, building within himself the foundations of character that would later be tested in ways he could not imagine. He walked through Rome's streets with observant eyes, noting the struggles of the poor and the excesses of the rich, learning compassion from what he witnessed, and storing up questions that would occupy his thoughts for decades to come. And somewhere in those early years, in the quiet spaces of study and reflection, Marcus began to discover something profound. That the greatest empire one could rule wasn't one of territories and legions, but the empire of one's own mind, the sovereignty of self-mastery, the realm of inner peace that no external circumstance could conquer or destroy. This, then, was the dawn of a gentle soul, the beginning of a journey that would take a thoughtful boy from the peaceful gardens of his childhood to the very heights of earthly power, and ultimately to a wisdom that would echo through the centuries long after the physical empire he served had crumbled into dust. As Marcus entered his teenage years, the quality of his education deepened like a river finding its true course. Rome, in the early years of his adolescence, was governed by the Emperor Hadrian, a man of remarkable culture and refinement, who had traveled extensively throughout the empire and who valued learning and the arts. Though Marcus had not yet come to the emperor's direct notice, the intellectual atmosphere of Hadrian's Rome provided fertile ground for a curious and thoughtful young mind. It was during these years that Marcus began to dress in the simple clothing of a philosopher, rejecting the fine garments that his station could have afforded him. This was more than youthful rebellion or affectation. It was a statement of values, a declaration that he wished to be judged not by his family's wealth or his social position, but by the content of his character and the quality of his thinking. His family indulged this tendency with a mixture of amusement and concern, but they could see that it came from a place of genuine conviction. He sought out teachers who could guide him deeper into philosophy, and Rome, being the great cosmopolitan center that it was, offered no shortage of learned men. There were Stoics and Epicureans, Platonists and Peripatetics, cynics who preached radical simplicity, and sophists who taught the art of persuasion. Marcus explored these various schools of thought with the systematic thoroughness that would characterize all his intellectual endeavors. But it was to Stoicism that his heart and mind were most drawn. Stoicism, with its emphasis on virtue, reason, and living in harmony with nature, resonated with something deep in Marcus's character. The Stoic teachers taught that the only true good was virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline, and that everything else, whether wealth or health, fame or comfort, was neither truly good nor truly bad, but simply preferred or not preferred. What mattered was not what happened to you, but how you responded to what happened. One of his most influential teachers during this period was a man named Apollonius of Chalcedon. Apollonius was a strict Stoic who lived his philosophy with uncompromising rigor. He taught Marcus that philosophy wasn't something you merely studied, but something you lived every hour of every day. When Apollonius was invited to tutor Marcus, he at first refused to come to Rome, insisting that the student should come to him, a lesson in humility that Marcus never forgot. When Apollonius finally did arrive in Rome, he demonstrated through his own example what it meant to be unmoved by external circumstances, to maintain equanimity in all situations, to face both praise and criticism with the same calm detachment. From Apollonius, Marcus learned to examine his own judgments and opinions, to question his automatic reactions to events, and to understand that suffering came not from circumstances themselves, but from our judgments about those circumstances. If you wanted to be free, Apollonius taught, you must free yourself from dependence on things beyond your control. You must learn to distinguish between what is up to you, your thoughts, your choices, your character, and what is not up to you, other people's actions, the course of events, the movements of fate. Another profound influence was Quintus Junius Rusticus, a man of deep learning and quiet dignity. Rusticus introduced Marcus to the writings of Epictetus, a former enslaved person who had become one of the most important Stoic philosophers. Epictetus's teachings, recorded by his student Orion in a collection known as the Discourses, would become like a second scripture to Marcus. Here was a philosopher who had lived through hardship and emerged with his dignity intact, who had developed a practical philosophy for navigating life's challenges with grace and resilience. Rusticus himself was a model of philosophical living. He was calm without being cold, serious without being severe, disciplined without being rigid. He taught Marcus to write down his own thoughts, to engage in the practice of what the Greeks called hypomnemata, personal notebooks where one recorded observations, reflected on experiences, and worked through philosophical problems. This practice of writing as a form of self-examination would stay with Marcus throughout his life, eventually resulting in the remarkable collection of private reflections that we now know as his Meditations. From Rusticus, Marcus also learned about patience and forbearance, about how to deal with difficult people without becoming bitter or angry. Rusticus taught him that when someone wrongs you, it is often because they are confused about what is truly good, because they don't understand that virtue is the only real good, and that vice is the only real evil. To become angry at such people, Rusticus would say, is like becoming angry at a fig tree for producing figs. They are acting according to their nature as they understand it. Your task is not to change them, that is beyond your control, but to maintain your own virtue, your own clear judgment, your own peace of mind. Marcus studied rhetoric as well, learning from the great teachers of oratory. But even here, his philosophical training colored his approach. He was not interested in rhetoric as mere showmanship or manipulation. He wanted to learn how to express truth clearly and persuasively, how to communicate complex ideas in ways that others could understand. He watched the famous orators in the Forum and noted both their strengths and their flaws, observing how often eloquence was used to obscure rather than illuminate, and resolving to use language as a tool for clarity and wisdom. The days followed a gentle rhythm. Marcus would rise before dawn, when the city was still wrapped in darkness and silence. He would begin with reading and reflection, perhaps reviewing passages from Epictetus or the earlier Stoics like Chrysippus and Cleanthes. As the sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, he would attend to his formal lessons, sitting with his tutors in quiet rooms where the morning light slanted through high windows, discussing ethics and logic, cosmology and physics, grammar and literature. Afternoons might be spent in physical exercise, for the Stoics believed in training the body as well as the mind. Marcus would practice wrestling or running, not seeking to dominate others or to win competitions, but simply to maintain his health and to understand through physical discipline the same principles he studied in philosophy: the importance of practice, the value of struggle, the satisfaction of gradual improvement. Evenings were for contemplation and writing. As the sun set over Rome, painting the marble facades in warm orange light, Marcus would sit with his wax tablets or papyrus scrolls, recording his thoughts, working through problems, reminding himself of philosophical principles he needed to remember. He wrote not for an audience, but for himself, as a form of spiritual exercise, a way of becoming the person he wanted to be. He was not, it should be said, a solemn or joyless young man. His seriousness was balanced by genuine affection for others, by kindness, by a quiet sense of humor. Those who knew him spoke of his warmth, his consideration, his ability to make others feel valued and heard. He had close friendships with other young men of similar temperament, and these relationships were characterized by mutual respect and philosophical discussion rather than by the kinds of excess and competition that marked some aristocratic friendships. The city around him continued its life. In the markets, vendors sold fish fresh from the Tiber and grain from the rich fields of Egypt. In the bathhouses, Romans of all classes gathered to socialize and relax. In the libraries, scholars copied manuscripts and debated interpretations. In the temples, the old rituals were maintained, even as many of the educated classes, like Marcus himself, found their spiritual sustenance more in philosophy than in traditional religion. Marcus observed all of this with the eye of someone who was both participant and witness. He was part of Rome, shaped by its culture and its traditions, yet he was also learning to step back from it, to see it with a certain philosophical detachment. This was one of the Stoic practices Rusticus had taught him: to imagine yourself as if from a great distance, to see your own life as just one small part of a vast cosmic drama, to recognize the transience of all human affairs, and thus to hold them lightly while still engaging with them fully. At night, when sleep came, Marcus sometimes dreamed of the countryside, of simple villages far from Rome's bustle, of quiet groves where ancient philosophers had once walked and taught. He dreamed of wisdom itself, imagined as a kind of clear, still pool where one could see straight to the bottom, where nothing was hidden or obscured. And sometimes he dreamed without images, experiencing only a sense of peace, a feeling of rightness, as if his soul recognized that it was on the correct path, moving in the direction it was meant to go. The years of his education were not marked by dramatic events or great crises. They were characterized instead by steady growth, by the patient accumulation of wisdom, by the slow transformation of a naturally thoughtful boy into a deeply philosophical young man. It was as if he were being carefully prepared for something, though what that something might be was not yet clear to anyone, perhaps not even to himself. And all the while, in the palace on the Palatine Hill, Emperor Hadrian was growing old and beginning to think about the question of succession, about who would lead the empire after he was gone. These thoughts, forming in the mind of the emperor, would soon reach out across Rome and touch the life of the young philosopher, drawing him toward a destiny that would test everything he had learned and become. In the year 138, when Marcus was 17 years old, the course of his life changed forever. Emperor Hadrian, whose health had been declining for some time, made a decision that would reshape the future of Rome. He chose as his successor a man named Antoninus, a senator known for his administrative ability, his calm temperament, and his moral character. But Hadrian's plans went deeper than a simple succession. He required that Antoninus, in turn, adopt 2 young men as his heirs, Marcus Annius Verus, whom we know as Marcus Aurelius, and Lucius Ceionius Commodus, who would become known as Lucius Verus. For Marcus, the news must have arrived like a wave that suddenly lifts you from solid ground. One moment he was a student of philosophy, focused on his books and his studies, concerned primarily with becoming a good and wise person. The next moment he was heir to the throne of the greatest empire in the world, destined to one day command legions, govern provinces, and shape the lives of millions. How did he receive this news? We can imagine him in a quiet room, perhaps in his grandfather's house, when the message came. Perhaps there was a moment of stunned silence, a pause in which the full weight of what was being asked of him settled onto his young shoulders. Perhaps he thought of his teachers, of Rusticus and Apollonius, and wondered what they would say about this turn of fate. But if there was shock, there was also acceptance. The Stoics taught that we must accept what fortune brings us, that resistance to fate is the source of misery. They taught that we are all assigned roles to play in the great drama of existence, and that the virtuous person plays their assigned role as well as they can, whether that role is king or commoner, general or slave. Marcus had been given a role. His philosophy now would be tested. Could he accept this role with equanimity? Could he serve in this capacity without being corrupted by power? Could he remain a philosopher while becoming an emperor? Antoninus Pius, as he came to be known after his adoption and accession, proved to be an excellent guardian for the young Marcus. Antoninus was a man of about 50 when he became emperor, mature and experienced, with a reputation for fairness and moderation. He had governed provinces successfully and had shown himself to be capable in administration. But more than that, he was a man of genuine goodness, someone who ruled not out of ambition or desire for glory, but out of a sense of duty and service. Marcus moved to the imperial palace, leaving behind the relative simplicity of his earlier life. The palace on the Palatine Hill was vast, a complex of buildings and courtyards, gardens and staterooms, where hundreds of people lived and worked. It was the nerve center of the empire, where dispatches arrived from distant frontiers, where ambassadors waited for audiences, where the machinery of governance churned day and night. But Antoninus was careful to preserve Marcus's philosophical education. He understood that the young man needed to be prepared not just in matters of state, but in matters of character. Marcus continued his studies, perhaps even more intensely now that he understood what was at stake. He read history, studying the lives of previous emperors, learning from their successes and their failures. He studied law and administration, understanding the complex web of regulations and traditions that held the empire together. And he continued his philosophical training, for this, he knew, would be his anchor in the storms to come. Antoninus himself became a kind of teacher to Marcus, though the lessons he taught were less formal than those of Rusticus or Apollonius. He taught by example, showing Marcus what it meant to rule with wisdom and restraint. When disputes arose between cities or provinces, Antoninus listened carefully to all sides before making his decisions. When senators squabbled over precedence or privileges, he maintained a calm detachment, never letting personal feelings cloud his judgment. When rumors and accusations circulated at court, as they always do in centers of power, he investigated carefully rather than acting impulsively. Marcus watched and learned. He saw how Antoninus was accessible to his subjects, how he maintained the old Roman virtue of civilitas, treating even the humblest citizens with respect. He saw how Antoninus lived simply despite his vast power, how he avoided unnecessary display and luxury. He saw how Antoninus was faithful to his wife Faustina, how he honored his family obligations, how he balanced the demands of public service with private virtue. The years under Antoninus's care were, in many ways, an extension of Marcus's education, but now with a practical dimension. He began to attend council meetings, sitting quietly at first, observing how decisions were made. He learned about tax policy and military logistics, about diplomatic negotiations and provincial administration. He learned about the complexities of grain supply, ensuring that Rome's 1,000,000 inhabitants had enough to eat. He learned about water management, maintaining the great aqueducts that brought fresh water to the city. He learned about trade routes and tariffs, about the delicate balance of relationships with peoples beyond the empire's borders. But perhaps more importantly, he learned about human nature. In the palace, he encountered every type of person. The ambitious who sought to use their proximity to power for personal gain, the sycophants who offered flattery rather than honest counsel, the truly capable who served quietly and effectively, the scheming who plotted and maneuvered. He saw how power corrupted some while refining others. He saw how the same circumstances could bring out nobility in one person and pettiness in another. His Stoic training helped him navigate these waters. He learned to examine his own reactions to praise and criticism, to notice when his ego was involved in decisions, to catch himself when he was acting out of vanity or anger rather than reason and virtue. He kept his practice of morning and evening reflection, using writing as a tool for self-examination and self-correction. During these years, Marcus also took on official responsibilities. He was given various titles and positions, serving as consul and holding other magistracies. These were not merely honorary positions. They involved real work and real decisions. But Marcus approached them with the same conscientiousness he brought to his studies. He prepared carefully for his duties, consulted with knowledgeable advisers, and tried always to act with fairness and wisdom. He also married during this period. His wife was Faustina the Younger, daughter of Antoninus Pius, and his wife Faustina the Elder. The marriage was arranged, as royal marriages often were, but it seems to have been, by the standards of the time, a successful union. Faustina bore Marcus many children, though tragically, as was common in that era. Several of them died in infancy or childhood. Each loss must have been a test of Marcus's philosophy, a challenge to maintain equanimity in the face of the deepest kind of human pain. How does a Stoic philosopher face the death of a child? The philosophy teaches that we should not be attached to things beyond our control, that we should remember the impermanence of all things, that we should accept fate with grace. But Marcus was not just a philosopher, he was a father. The tension between philosophical principle and human emotion must have been agonizing. In his later writings, we see glimpses of how he grappled with loss, how he reminded himself that children are mortal, that to have them is not to own them, that grief itself is natural, but should not be indulged to the point where it undermines one's ability to function and serve. The Rome of Antoninus's reign was peaceful and prosperous. The emperor avoided unnecessary conflicts, governed with moderation, and maintained the stability that Hadrian had established. The provinces flourished. Trade routes remained open and safe. The frontiers were quiet. It was, in many ways, the golden afternoon of the Roman Empire, a time when it seemed that Roman civilization might continue indefinitely, bringing order and culture to an ever wider circle of peoples. But Marcus, studying history as he did, knew that all empires eventually decline. He knew that peace was always temporary, that the barbarians beyond the frontiers were growing stronger and more organized, that internal contradictions and economic pressures were slowly building. He did not share these thoughts widely. There was no point in disturbing the prevailing optimism. But he prepared himself mentally for harder times that might come. The seasons continued their ancient pattern. Springs came, bringing renewal to the gardens and countryside. Summers arrived with their heat and their brightness. Autumns brought harvest and reflection. Winters brought rest and preparation for the new cycle to begin again. And with each passing season, Marcus matured, growing from a young man into someone ready for the enormous responsibilities that awaited him. Antoninus grew older, his hair whitening, his movements slower. But his mind remained clear, his judgment sound. He continued to rule with the same steady wisdom that had characterized his entire reign. And when he looked at Marcus, he must have felt satisfied, knowing that he was leaving the empire in capable hands, that this young man he had adopted and trained would carry on the work of good governance. In the evenings, Marcus would sometimes walk in the palace gardens, where flowering trees released their fragrance into the cooling air, where fountains created pockets of sound that masked the noise of the city beyond the walls. In these moments of solitude, he would reflect on all that had happened, on all that he had learned, on the strange path that had brought him from a quiet student's life to the threshold of supreme power. And he would remind himself of what his teachers had taught him, that power is not a privilege, but a burden, not an opportunity for self-aggrandizement, but a chance to serve others, not something to be sought, but something to be accepted with humility and exercised with wisdom. He would remind himself that emperors, like all mortals, live and die, that their power is temporary, that what matters is not the title they hold, but the character they maintain, the good they do, the example they set. The night sky above Rome was the same sky that had shone on the city's founding centuries before. The stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human affairs, neither praising Rome's greatness nor lamenting its eventual decline. And standing beneath those stars, Marcus understood something profound, that he was part of something much larger than himself, that his individual life was just one small thread in an infinite cosmic weaving, and that the meaning of his life would be found not in his power or his achievements, but in how well he maintained his virtue, his reason, his humanity in whatever circumstances fate presented to him. In the year 161, after 23 years of peaceful and prosperous rule, Emperor Antoninus Pius passed away quietly at his country estate. He was 74 years old, and his death, though mourned, was accepted as the natural end of a life well lived. The Senate promptly proclaimed Marcus as his successor, and at the age of 39, Marcus Aurelius became Emperor of Rome. But Marcus did something unusual. He insisted that Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, who had been designated as co-heir by Hadrian so many years before, should rule alongside him as equal co-emperor. This was unprecedented in Roman history. Never before had there been two emperors with equal authority. The Senate worried that such an arrangement might lead to conflict or division, but Marcus was insistent. He felt it was what Hadrian had intended, and more than that, he felt it was the right thing to do. This decision tells us much about Marcus's character. Here was a man who had just been given absolute power over the greatest empire in the world, and his first act was to share that power, to voluntarily limit his own authority. It was an act of remarkable humility and justice, the kind of act that his Stoic training had prepared him for. Power, to Marcus, was not something to be hoarded or jealously guarded, but something to be used wisely for the common good. The transition of power was smooth, a testament to Antoninus's careful planning and to the stability of the Roman system. But almost immediately, challenges began to emerge. The peaceful world that Antoninus had presided over was about to become significantly more complicated and difficult. In the east, the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival beyond the Euphrates, launched an invasion of Armenia and Syria. The Parthians had been quiet during Antoninus's reign, but they had used that time to rebuild their strength, and now they saw an opportunity to test the new emperor. The Roman legions in the east were pushed back, cities were threatened, and it became clear that a major military response would be necessary. Marcus decided that Lucius Verus should lead the campaign. Lucius was younger, more physically vigorous, more naturally suited to military leadership. But this meant that Marcus would bear the full burden of administration in Rome, handling all the routine business of governance while his co-emperor was away. It was a heavy load, but Marcus accepted it without complaint. This was his duty, his assigned role, and he would perform it to the best of his ability. The dispatches from the east arrived regularly, bringing news of campaigns and battles. Marcus read them carefully, making decisions about reinforcements and supply, coordinating with his generals, managing the diplomatic aspects of the conflict. War, even when conducted at a distance, was exhausting and troubling. Marcus, with his philosophical temperament, found nothing glorious in warfare. He saw it as a necessary evil sometimes, a response to aggression, but never as something to be celebrated or enjoyed. The war dragged on for several years. There were victories and setbacks, advances and retreats. Slowly, the Roman legions regained the initiative, pushing the Parthians back, restoring Roman control over the disputed territories. Lucius Verus enjoyed the campaign, the excitement of military life, the camaraderie of the officers' tent. But he also contracted some illness during the campaign, perhaps malaria or something similar, that would affect his health for the rest of his relatively short life. Meanwhile, in Rome and throughout the empire, a different kind of crisis was emerging. A plague began to spread, brought back, it was said, by soldiers returning from the east. This plague, which historians would later call the Antonine plague, was devastating. It swept through cities and countryside, killing rich and poor alike, weakening the empire's population, disrupting trade and agriculture, and creating a sense of anxiety and fear that pervaded all levels of society. Marcus responded to the plague with characteristic thoroughness. He organized medical responses as best he could with the limited understanding of disease available in that era. He ensured that food supplies continued to reach affected areas. He maintained order and prevented panic, but there was only so much he could do. The plague would continue for years, killing millions across the empire, fundamentally weakening Rome's human resources at precisely the time when those resources would be most needed. And there were other problems as well. The Tiber River flooded, causing extensive damage in Rome and disrupting the grain supply. There were food shortages. There were fires in various parts of the city. There were financial pressures as the cost of the Eastern War mounted. Marcus had to find money for the military campaigns, and he did so by selling off imperial possessions, including items from the palace itself, rather than raising taxes on an already burdened population. This was an act of personal sacrifice, a recognition that the emperor's wealth was not his own, but belonged, in a sense, to the people he served. Through all of this, Marcus maintained his philosophical practices. Each morning and evening, he would take time for reflection and writing. In the precious quiet moments between administrative duties, he would remind himself of Stoic principles, would work through his reactions to events, would strive to maintain equanimity in the face of mounting pressures. His writings from this period, some of which survive in what we call the Meditations, reveal a man struggling to apply philosophy to real-world challenges. He reminds himself that external events are neither good nor bad in themselves, that what matters is his response to them. He reminds himself that difficulties are opportunities to practice virtue, that obstacles can be turned into opportunities for growth. He reminds himself that he is part of a larger whole, that his individual struggles are insignificant from the cosmic perspective, yet his moral choices are of ultimate importance. But we also see, reading between the lines, the strain he was under. He reminds himself not to become embittered or cynical. He reminds himself to treat others with patience and kindness even when they are difficult or frustrating. He reminds himself that anger and irritation are forms of weakness, that the strong person remains calm regardless of provocation. These reminders suggest that he was indeed feeling the emotions he was trying to control, that maintaining his philosophical composure required constant effort and vigilance. His relationship with Faustina continued, and she bore more children during these years. But the mortality rate remained high, and more of their children died, each death a fresh wound. Marcus tried to comfort Faustina while managing his own grief, tried to be present for his surviving children while handling the enormous demands of empire. The tension between private life and public duty was constant and exhausting. There were moments of respite, brief periods when he could retreat to a country villa or spend time in contemplation. But these were rare. The empire demanded his attention constantly. There were always decisions to be made, always crises to address, always people who needed his judgment or his help. And then, in 169, Lucius Verus died suddenly, possibly from stroke, while returning from the northern frontier where new problems were emerging. Marcus, who had shared power for 8 years, was now sole emperor. The loss of Lucius, despite their different temperaments and approaches, was genuinely felt by Marcus. They had been brothers, even if not by blood, and had worked together to manage the empire's challenges. But there was no time for extended mourning. The situation on the northern frontier was deteriorating rapidly. Germanic tribes, Marcomanni, Quadi, Iazyges, and others were crossing the Danube in large numbers, raiding Roman territory, threatening Roman cities, creating chaos and fear. This was not a simple border raid that could be handled by local commanders. This was a major invasion, perhaps the most serious threat to the empire's northern borders in generations. Marcus realized that he would have to leave Rome, would have to take personal command of the military response. This was not something he wanted to do. He was a philosopher, not a general. He was more comfortable with books than with battlefields. But duty called, and Marcus, true to his principles, would answer that call. As he prepared to depart for the frontier, he must have looked around at the Rome he was leaving behind. The city of marble and memory, of temples and theatres, of libraries and law courts. The city that had been his home, the centre of his world. And he must have wondered, with the prescience that sometimes comes to thoughtful people, whether life would ever again be as secure and comfortable as it had been under Antoninus's peaceful reign. The age of peace was ending. The age of struggle was beginning. And Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor, was about to face the greatest test of his life and his philosophy. Would his Stoic training sustain him through the trials ahead? Would he be able to maintain his virtue and his humanity while directing military campaigns and making life and death decisions? These questions would be answered in the years to come, answered not in the comfortable study of a philosopher, but in the harsh conditions of military camps, in the mud and cold of the Danube frontier, in circumstances that would test him more severely than any theoretical problem ever could. The sun set over Rome as Marcus prepared for his departure, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, colours that might have reminded him of the impermanence of all things, of how quickly peace can turn to conflict, prosperity to struggle. But the same sunset also carried a kind of beauty, a reminder that even in difficult times there is something eternal and unchanging about the natural order, something that persists regardless of human affairs. And so he prepared himself, mentally and spiritually, for the journey ahead, carrying with him not weapons or ambitions, but rather the simple principles that had guided his life thus far. To do his duty, to maintain his virtue, to treat others with justice and compassion, and to accept whatever fate brought with courage and equanimity. The journey from Rome to the Danube frontier took Marcus through a landscape gradually changing from the cultivated beauty of Italy to the wilder, more contested territories of the northern provinces. Each day brought him closer to a world far removed from the philosophical discussions and administrative duties he had known. This was a world of military camps and supply trains, of scouts and sentries, of constant vigilance against an enemy that struck suddenly and then melted back into the forests beyond the river. Marcus arrived at the frontier in 170, establishing his headquarters in various cities along the Danube. Places like Carnuntum and Vindobona, settlements that served as bases for the legions defending the empire's northern borders. These were not the marble cities of the Mediterranean world. They were functional military towns, built of wood and stone, with practical walls and watchtowers, where soldiers from across the empire gathered to face a common threat. The situation Marcus found was more serious than reports had suggested. The Germanic tribes were not simply raiding, they were attempting to cross into Roman territory in large numbers, seeking land and resources. They had formed coalitions, unusual for these typically independent peoples, and their combined forces represented a genuine threat to the empire's security. Roman cities had been besieged, Roman citizens had fled their homes, and there was a real possibility that the invaders might break through into Italy itself. Marcus set about organizing the defense with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to all his responsibilities. He met with his generals, studying maps and intelligence reports, learning about the terrain and the enemy's tactics. He ensured that supplies reached the troops, that reinforcements were properly deployed, that the complex logistics of maintaining an army in the field were carefully managed. But this was not a war that would be won quickly. The campaigns along the Danube would stretch on for years, becoming the defining challenge of Marcus's reign. The fighting was often inconclusive. Victories would be followed by setbacks, gains by losses. The Germanic tribes were fierce warriors, familiar with the local terrain, capable of disappearing into the forests and swamps when Roman legions advanced, then emerging to strike when least expected. Marcus lived in military camps, sharing the hardships of his soldiers. His quarters were simple, a tent or a room in a fortified building, furnished with only the necessities. He rose early, as he always had, but now his morning reflections were punctuated by reports of enemy movements and decisions about the day's operations. He ate the same food as his troops, endured the same cold and discomfort, demonstrated the same stoic endurance he had always preached. In the evenings, after the day's business was concluded, Marcus would return to his philosophical writings. It was during these years on the frontier that much of his meditations was written, reflections composed not in the peaceful library of a palace, but in a military tent with the sounds of an army camp all around, the calls of sentries, the crackling of cooking fires, the distant howling of wolves in the forests beyond a perimeter. Reading these writings, we see Marcus grappling with the challenges of his situation. He reminds himself that he is part of something larger than himself, that he is just one actor in a vast cosmic drama. He reflects on death, noting that he is surrounded by it, the death of soldiers in battle, the death of civilians caught in the conflict, the constant presence of mortality that military campaigns make impossible to ignore. He writes about dealing with difficult people, and we can imagine he's thinking of the challenges of military command. Generals who disagree with his decisions, officers who are incompetent or corrupt, soldiers who complain or shirk their duties. He reminds himself to be patient, to remember that others are doing the best they can with the understanding they have, that anger and frustration accomplish nothing. He reflects on the nature of leadership, understanding that his decisions affect thousands of lives, that his failures or successes ripple outward in ways he can barely comprehend. The weight of command sits heavily on him, but he tries to carry it lightly, to make decisions based on reason and justice rather than emotion or ego. The plague continued to affect the army, spreading through the crowded conditions of military camps, weakening units at crucial moments. Marcus watched men die, not in battle, but in sickbeds, their bodies racked with fever, their strength ebbing away. Each death was a reminder of human fragility, of the thin line between life and death that we all walk, whether in times of peace or war. Winter campaigns were particularly brutal. The Danube region could be bitterly cold, with snow and ice making movement difficult, with soldiers suffering from frostbite and exposure. But operations had to continue year-round. To cease campaigning would give the enemy time to regroup and strengthen. Marcus, who had grown up in the mild climate of Rome, now experienced winters that tested physical endurance as much as moral resolve. Yet there were also moments of quiet beauty. Sunrise over the Danube, the great river catching the early light and turning it into liquid gold. The forests in autumn, aflame with color. Stars at night, perhaps seeming brighter here than in the light-polluted sky above Rome. Marcus noticed these things, recorded them in his thoughts, found in them reminders of the eternal patterns of nature that continue regardless of human conflict. He also dealt with administrative matters from the frontier. Dispatches arrived regularly from Rome and from other provinces, requiring his attention and decisions. He couldn't simply focus on military affairs and ignore the rest of the empire. He had to balance his attention between immediate military needs and long-term imperial concerns, between the crisis at hand and the ongoing requirements of good governance. His family was affected by his absence. Faustina joined him at the frontier for periods, bringing some of their surviving children. This was unusual. Emperors typically left their families safely in Rome, but Marcus wanted them near him when possible. However, this also meant exposing them to the dangers and hardships of the military zone. In 175, Faustina died while at the frontier, another crushing loss for Marcus to absorb and continue functioning despite. The campaigns continued. There were battles, sometimes large engagements where legions clashed with tribal warriors, sometimes smaller skirmishes and ambushes. Marcus didn't personally lead charges into battle. That wasn't the role of an emperor, and besides, his skills lay elsewhere. But he was present, visible to his troops, sharing their dangers, if not always their direct combat. He negotiated with tribal leaders, attempting to find diplomatic solutions when possible. He understood that not every problem required a military solution, that treaties and agreements could sometimes achieve what swords could not. He granted terms to tribes willing to settle peacefully, accepted hostages and tribute, used the full range of imperial tools, military, diplomatic, economic, to address the complex situation. The psychological toll of these years was enormous. Marcus was away from the comforts of civilization, immersed in the ugliness of warfare, making decisions that led to death, witnessing suffering on a vast scale. His Stoic philosophy helped him maintain equilibrium, helped him avoid being overwhelmed by the horror and tragedy surrounding him. But it didn't make him immune to pain or grief. It simply gave him tools to process those emotions without being destroyed by them. He reflected often on duty, on how we don't choose the circumstances of our lives, but must respond to them as best we can. He hadn't chosen to be emperor during a time of plague and invasion. He hadn't chosen to spend his mature years in military camps rather than philosophical schools. But these were the circumstances fate had given him, and his task was to meet them with virtue and wisdom. Years passed in this way. The seasonal cycle continued. Spring campaigns when the ground dried and movement became easier, summer battles, autumn retreats, winter preparations. The war became a kind of routine, not in the sense of being easy or comfortable, but in the sense of establishing a pattern that Marcus learned to navigate. Gradually, through persistent effort, through military pressure combined with diplomatic overtures, through the sheer determination of the Roman system to prevail, the situation began to stabilize. The Germanic tribes were pushed back, treaties were concluded, defensive positions were strengthened. The immediate crisis was managed, though it never entirely went away. The northern frontier would remain a challenge for Rome for generations to come. But the acute danger was diminished. Marcus, now in his 50s, had spent much of his adult life dealing with warfare and its consequences. The philosopher emperor had become, by necessity, a military commander. But remarkably, he had managed to maintain his philosophical principles throughout. He had not become hardened or cruel. He had not lost his humanity in the brutality of conflict. He had continued to practice self-examination, to strive for virtue, to treat others with justice and compassion. Looking back from our perspective, we can see these northern campaigns as a turning point in Roman history. The empire had been tested and had survived, but the experience had been exhausting. Resources had been depleted, population had been reduced by plague and warfare, and the myth of Roman invincibility had been challenged. The long peace of the 2nd century was giving way to the more troubled times that would characterize the 3rd century. But Marcus didn't have the luxury of this historical perspective. He simply knew that he had done his duty, had responded to the challenges of his time as best he could, had tried to rule with wisdom and justice even in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. And perhaps that was enough, not to succeed perfectly, not to solve every problem, but to face what came with courage and integrity, to maintain one's character even when tested by fire and hardship. As he sat in his tent on the frontier, writing by lamplight while the camp settled into evening quiet, Marcus must have thought sometimes about the life he might have had, the life of pure philosophy he had once envisioned for himself. But that wasn't the life fate had given him. Instead, he had been called to serve in a different way, to be not just a philosopher, but a philosopher-ruler, to test his principles not in the comfort of a school, but in the harsh laboratory of real-world governance and military necessity. And perhaps, in the end, this made his philosophy more valuable, more meaningful. It's one thing to talk about virtue and duty in an academy. It's another to practice them in the mud and blood of the Danube frontier. Marcus had done both, and in doing so had demonstrated something profound about the practical applicability of Stoic philosophy, about its power to sustain and guide even in the darkest and most challenging circumstances. Throughout all these years of external struggle, the wars, the plague, the countless administrative challenges, Marcus maintained what the Stoics called an inner citadel, a fortress of the mind that remained unassailable regardless of external circumstances. This concept, central to his philosophy, was not just a theory he discussed, but a practice he lived daily, and it was perhaps his greatest achievement as both philosopher and emperor. Each morning, as the camp began to stir with the activities of the new day, Marcus would begin his mental preparations. He would remind himself of basic Stoic principles, that he would encounter difficult people today, people who were selfish, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest. But he reminded himself that they acted out of ignorance of what was truly good, that they were, in a sense, his brothers, sharing in the same rational nature. To become angry at them would be like a limb becoming angry at another part of the same body. He would prepare himself for disappointment, for plans that wouldn't work out as intended, for news that might be discouraging. By expecting these things, by premeditation of evils as the Stoics called it, he was less likely to be knocked off balance when they occurred. He wasn't being pessimistic, he was being realistic, understanding that life includes difficulties and that the wise person prepares mentally for them. This practice of morning reflection was a kind of spiritual armor he put on each day. It didn't make him invulnerable to the slings and arrows of fortune, but it helped him receive them without being destroyed. It allowed him to maintain his equilibrium, his sense of purpose, his basic humanity, even when circumstances might have crushed someone less prepared. He also practiced what we might call mindfulness today, a careful attention to the present moment. The Stoics taught that we suffer primarily from dwelling on the past, which cannot be changed, or worrying about the future, which hasn't happened and may never happen. The only moment we truly possess is the present, this instant now. And if we can simply handle this present moment well, we need not be overwhelmed by the vastness of our challenges. This was particularly important for Marcus, who bore such enormous responsibilities. If he thought about all the problems of the empire simultaneously, all the threats and challenges and difficulties, he might have been paralyzed by the weight of it all. But by focusing on what needed to be done right now, in this moment, he could break the overwhelming whole into manageable parts. He also practiced what the Stoics called view from above, imagining himself from a great distance, seeing his life as just one small part of a vast cosmic process. From this perspective, his personal troubles, even the great affairs of empire, shrink to their proper size. The Stoic cosmos was infinite and eternal. Individual human lives were brief flickers in comparison. This wasn't meant to make life meaningless, but rather to provide perspective, to help distinguish between what truly matters, virtue, character, how we treat others, and what doesn't, external circumstances, honors, possessions. In his meditations, Marcus often reflected on the transience of all things. Great empires rise and fall. Famous people are eventually forgotten. Everything that exists will eventually cease to exist. He found this thought not depressing, but liberating. If everything is temporary, then we need not cling to things, need not be devastated when we lose them. We can hold everything lightly while still engaging with life fully. He thought often about death, not in a morbid way, but as a natural process, no more to be feared than any other natural change. Death was simply a transformation, a dissolution of the elements that temporarily came together to form a person. Every moment we are dying. Cells are dying, time is passing, our younger selves are ceasing to exist. To fear death was irrational. It was simply a part of the natural order, no more to be resisted than the changing of seasons. This meditation on mortality helped Marcus maintain perspective. When faced with a difficult general, a supply problem, a diplomatic challenge, he could step back and ask, will this matter in 100 years? Will it matter in 1,000 years? Usually the answer was no, and this allowed him to handle the situation with appropriate seriousness, but not overwhelming anxiety. He also reflected on interconnectedness, the Stoic idea that everything in the universe is connected, that nothing exists in isolation. Every person was part of the whole, every event was connected to every other event in a vast web of causation. This meant that even in his struggles, even in his suffering, he was participating in something larger than himself, playing his assigned role in the cosmic drama. This idea of interconnectedness also fostered compassion. If we are all parts of the same whole, then to harm another is ultimately to harm ourselves. To benefit another is to benefit ourselves. We are like branches of the same tree, organs in the same body. This perspective helped Marcus treat even his enemies with a certain respect, understanding that they too were part of the same human family, the same natural order. His writings during this period also show him wrestling with the question of how to maintain goodness in the midst of difficulty. How do you stay kind when surrounded by cruelty? How do you remain just when others are unjust? How do you preserve your humanity when the situation seems designed to strip it away? His answer was that virtue is its own reward, that the good life consists in practicing virtue regardless of external circumstances, that the sage is happy even in the midst of hardship, because happiness comes from inner harmony, not external conditions. But Marcus was honest about the difficulty of this practice. His reminders to himself are often quite direct. Don't waste time on useless emotions. Let go of your anger. Why are you surprised that someone has done something bad? You have power over your mind, not external events. Realize this, and you will find strength. These weren't platitudes spoken by someone who found virtue easy. They were tools used by someone who found it difficult, who needed constant reminding and practice. He also reflected on the nature of time and the importance of using it well. Time was the one truly limited resource. Unlike money or possessions which could be replenished, time once spent was gone forever. Therefore, every moment had to be used intentionally, purposefully. Not that life had to be filled with constant activity. Rest and recreation had their place. But that even rest should be conscious, chosen, not simply the result of drifting or distraction. This consciousness about time made Marcus very careful about how he spent his days. He avoided unnecessary meetings, useless conversations, activities that didn't serve a real purpose. He was present with people when he was with them, rather than being physically present, but mentally elsewhere. He treated each day as if it might be his last, not in a panicked way, but in a way that focused his attention on what truly mattered. Another practice Marcus maintained was gratitude. Despite all his challenges, despite the hardships and losses, he regularly reflected on things he was grateful for. In his meditations, he lists the virtues he learned from various teachers and family members, the good examples he was given, the opportunities he had to develop his character. Gratitude wasn't just a pleasant feeling, it was a tool for maintaining perspective, for remembering that even in difficult times, there are gifts, there are goods, there are reasons to appreciate life. He was also careful about his attention and his judgments. The Stoics taught that our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our judgments about events. If something happens and we judge it to be terrible, catastrophic, unbearable, then we will suffer accordingly. But if we judge it more neutrally, as simply a thing that has happened, we maintain our peace of mind. This didn't mean being passive or accepting injustice. Marcus still worked to fix problems, to improve situations, to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But he did so from a place of calm deliberation rather than emotional reaction. He distinguished between what he could control, his own thoughts and actions, and what he couldn't control, other people's actions, the outcome of events, and he focused his energy accordingly. His inner fortress was also sustained by his continuing relationships with philosophy itself. Even in the midst of military campaigns, he continued to read, to study, to engage with the ideas of the great thinkers who had come before him. He carried books with him, sought out learned men for discussion when possible, treated his evening writing sessions as a form of philosophical practice. Philosophy wasn't an escape from his duties. It was what enabled him to fulfill his duties effectively. And perhaps most importantly, his inner fortress was characterized by a kind of gentle acceptance of reality. Not resignation or passivity, but a clear-eyed understanding that the universe unfolds according to its own nature, that we are part of a larger order that we don't fully understand and can't control. To struggle against the basic facts of existence, that we are mortal, that we will suffer losses, that we can't control others, that empires rise and fall, is to guarantee misery. But to accept these facts while still acting virtuously within them is to find a kind of peace that external circumstances can never disturb. This was Marcus's great achievement, to maintain this inner fortress through some of the most difficult circumstances any emperor ever faced, to remain a philosopher while being an emperor, to keep his humanity while exercising enormous power, to practice virtue not just in theory, but in the harsh testing ground of reality. His meditations, written during these challenging years, stands as testimony to this achievement, not a triumphant declaration of victory, but a humble record of ongoing effort, of daily practice, of the continual work of maintaining one's character in the face of difficulty. While military campaigns and philosophical reflection occupied much of Marcus's attention during his later years, he never neglected the practical business of governance. Even from the frontier, he continued to manage the vast machinery of the Roman Empire, making decisions that affected millions of lives, setting policies that would shape the future of Roman civilization. His approach to governance was shaped by his philosophical principles. He believed that a ruler existed to serve the ruled, not the other way around. The emperor's power was not a personal possession, but a trust, a responsibility given to him for the benefit of all. This wasn't merely a pleasant theory. It determined how he actually exercised power on a daily basis. One of Marcus's constant concerns was justice. He believed that the law should apply equally to everyone, that the poor should receive the same consideration as the rich, that no one should be above accountability. He personally reviewed legal cases, especially those involving capital punishment, ensuring that sentences were just and that executions were only carried out when absolutely necessary. He expanded the rights of enslaved people and of women, recognizing their humanity in ways that were progressive for his time. He was accessible to his subjects in ways that many emperors were not. People could petition him directly, could bring their grievances to his attention. He listened carefully, consulted with advisors, and tried to make fair decisions. This accessibility was born of his philosophical conviction that all humans shared the same rational nature and thus deserved respect and consideration regardless of their social status. His administration was characterized by competence and integrity. He chose officials based on merit rather than on family connections or political considerations. He expected high standards from those who served in imperial positions and removed those who proved corrupt or incompetent. He understood that good governance required good people, that policies were only as effective as the administrators who implemented them. Financial management was another area of concern. The costs of the wars, combined with the economic disruption caused by the plague, put enormous strain on imperial finances. Marcus refused to simply raise taxes, knowing that the burden would fall primarily on those least able to bear it. Instead, he economized in every way possible, selling off personal possessions, reducing expenditures in the palace, eliminating unnecessary positions in the bureaucracy. He also reformed the military in various ways, understanding that the traditional Roman system needed adaptation to face the new challenges emerging on the frontiers. He reorganized some units, created new positions, adjusted strategies based on what was learned from the campaigns. But he did so carefully, respecting tradition while adapting to necessity, never changing things simply for the sake of change, but only when there was clear reason to do so. His approach to the provinces was enlightened for his time. He saw them not as territories to be exploited, but as integral parts of the empire, deserving of fair treatment and good governance. He appointed capable governors, monitored their behavior, responded to complaints from provincial populations. He understood that the empire's strength depended on the prosperity and contentment of its diverse peoples, not just on military force. He also dealt with religious questions, a complex issue in the multi-faith empire. Rome had traditionally been tolerant of different religions, as long as they didn't threaten public order. But there were tensions, particularly regarding the growing Christian community, which refused to participate in traditional Roman religious practices. Marcus, despite his own philosophical leanings, maintained traditional policies toward Christians, which unfortunately meant periods of persecution. This is perhaps the most troubling aspect of his reign from a modern perspective, a reminder that even the wisest rulers are products of their time and cultural context. His legislative work showed attention to practical details. He passed laws regulating everything from inheritance rights to the treatment of gladiators, from procedures in law courts to management of public works. These weren't grand gestures, but rather the careful work of someone trying to make the system function more fairly and efficiently. He understood that good governance happened in the accumulation of small improvements, not just in dramatic reforms. Education was another concern. Marcus believed in the civilizing power of Greek and Roman culture, in the importance of education for developing both intellectual and moral capacities. He supported schools, libraries, and teachers, understanding that the empire's future depended on cultivating wisdom in the next generation, not just military prowess. He also dealt with succession, a question that had troubled Rome throughout its history. Marcus had a son, Commodus, who was being groomed to inherit the throne. Unlike many emperors, Marcus didn't need to adopt an heir from outside his family. But this presented its own challenges. Commodus was very different from his father, less interested in philosophy, less committed to duty, more drawn to the pleasures and spectacles that Marcus himself found distasteful. Marcus's handling of Commodus is one of the more debated aspects of his reign. Should he have recognized that his son was unsuited for rule? Should he have chosen a more capable successor, as Hadrian and Antoninus had done? Or was he following the natural and Roman pattern of father-to-son succession? We can't know what went through Marcus's mind as he watched his son develop, as he tried to educate and prepare him for the responsibilities that would one day be his. Perhaps he hoped that maturity and experience would bring wisdom. Perhaps he felt that blood succession was the most stable option. Perhaps he was simply following what seemed natural and traditional. Whatever his reasoning, the decision to name Commodus as heir would have unfortunate consequences after Marcus's death. But from Marcus's perspective, he was doing what seemed right and responsible, preparing his son as best he could while handling all his other enormous responsibilities. His governance style was characterized by what we might call servant leadership. He didn't see himself as above others, but rather as someone with particular responsibilities, particular duties that he was obligated to fulfill. When people called him emperor, he was conscious that this was a role he was playing, a function he was serving, not his essential identity. His essential identity was as a human being, a member of the cosmopolis, the universal city that included all rational creatures. This perspective helped him avoid the corruption that often comes with power. He didn't need to prove his importance or defend his ego. He could admit mistakes, accept criticism, acknowledge when others knew better than he did. This humility made him more effective as a ruler, not less, because it allowed him to learn, to adapt, to use the talents and knowledge of those around him. He also tried to model the behavior he wanted to see in others. He couldn't require virtue from his subjects and officials if he wasn't practicing it himself. He couldn't demand honesty if he was dishonest, justice if he was unjust, self-control if he was self-indulgent. His personal example mattered, and he knew it. The emperor set the tone for the entire administration, and Marcus tried to set a tone of integrity, diligence, and fairness. His working day was long and demanding. After his morning reflections and any military or administrative meetings, he would attend to correspondence, reading and responding to dispatches from across the empire. He would meet with advisors and officials, discussing policies and problems. He would review legal cases and appeals. He would make appointments and promotions. He would monitor the empire's finances. All of this required sustained attention and careful judgment. But he also understood the importance of rest and renewal. He didn't drive himself to complete exhaustion, recognizing that effective leadership required a clear mind and sufficient energy. He took breaks when needed, spent time with his family when possible, maintained his practice of evening reflection and writing. He understood that governance was a marathon, not a sprint, and paced himself accordingly. Through all of this work, the practical daily business of running an empire, Marcus maintained his philosophical perspective. He saw governance not as an opportunity for personal glory, but as a way of serving others, of participating in the universal community of rational beings. Every decision, every policy, every judgment was an opportunity to practice virtue, to act with wisdom and justice, to contribute to the common good. And in this way, the philosopher became the ideal emperor, not through abandoning philosophy for practical politics, but by bringing philosophy to bear on practical politics, by demonstrating that wisdom and power could coexist, that the contemplative life and the active life could be integrated, that one could be both a thinker and a doer, both a sage and a ruler. As Marcus entered his 50s, the weight of years and hardships began to tell on his health. The plague had affected him, though not fatally. The campaigns had exhausted him physically. The constant stress of rule had worn on him. Death, which had always been a philosophical topic for reflection, became increasingly a personal reality to contemplate. But Marcus approached this prospect as he approached everything else, with calm acceptance and thoughtful reflection. Death to the Stoic was natural, inevitable, nothing to be feared. It was simply a transformation, a return of the elements that temporarily composed a person back to the universe from which they came. Just as birth brought these elements together, death separated them again. It was part of the cycle, no more to be feared than autumn following summer or night following day. In his meditations, Marcus returned again and again to this theme. He reminded himself that death could come at any moment, that he should live each day as if it might be his last, not in a frantic or anxious way, but with full presence and commitment. If this were his last day, what would be important? Not accumulating possessions, not seeking honors, not indulging in pleasures, but acting virtuously, treating others well, maintaining his integrity. He reflected on the countless generations who had lived and died before him. Emperors and slaves, philosophers and fools, heroes and villains, all had their moment on the stage of life, and then passed into oblivion. In a few generations, he too would be forgotten, or at best remembered as a name in a history book, his actual experiences, thoughts and feelings lost forever. This wasn't a depressing thought, but a liberating one. If fame doesn't last, if memory fades, then we should act rightly, not for recognition, but because it is right in itself. He thought about the famous people of the past, people who in their time seemed so important, so powerful. Where were they now? Dust and ashes, their empires gone, their ambitions forgotten, their fears and hopes dissolved into nothingness. And so it would be with him, with his empire, with all the structures and systems that seemed so solid and permanent. Everything is in flux, everything changes, nothing endures forever. But this didn't make life meaningless. Quite the opposite. If our time is limited, if this moment is all we truly have, then this moment matters infinitely. How we act right now, how we treat the person in front of us, how we fulfill our duty in this instant. These things matter, even if no one will remember them, even if they have no lasting consequence. They matter because acting virtuously is good in itself, because living well is its own reward. Marcus also reflected on legacy, not in terms of fame or reputation, but in terms of what kind of world he left behind. Would the empire be more just because of his efforts? Would people be better off because of his policies? Would his children and the next generation have a better foundation on which to build? These were questions worth considering, even if he couldn't know the full answers. He thought often about his responsibilities to future generations. What kind of Rome would Commodus inherit? What challenges would he face? Marcus had done what he could to stabilize the frontiers, to maintain justice and good governance, to leave the treasury in reasonable condition despite the enormous costs of the wars and the plague. But he couldn't guarantee the future. All he could do was his best in his own time and trust that others would do their best in theirs. The question of Commodus troubled him. He could see that his son lacked his own commitment to philosophy and duty. But what could he do? He had tried to educate him, had given him responsibilities, had attempted to shape his character. But people are not infinitely malleable. They have their own natures, their own inclinations. Perhaps Commodus would mature. Perhaps the responsibilities of rule would bring out qualities that weren't currently visible. Or perhaps not. Either way, Marcus had done what he could and would have to accept what came. He also reflected on his own accomplishments and failures. He had maintained the empire, defended its borders, administered justice, tried to rule wisely and well. But he had also presided over years of war and plague, had made decisions that led to suffering, had failed to solve problems that would plague Rome long after he was gone. He accepted both the successes and the failures with equanimity. He had done his best with the circumstances he was given. That was all anyone could do. His relationship with Faustina had ended with her death, and this too was a subject for reflection. Their marriage had produced many children, though most had died young. She had been his companion through many challenges, had shared the hardships of the frontier, had supported him in his duties. Her loss was one more reminder of the impermanence of all human connections, of how we can never truly possess another person, of how death eventually separates everyone. Marcus thought about his own teachers, most of whom were now dead, Rusticus, Apollonius, and others who had shaped his thinking and his character. Their wisdom lived on in him, in the principles they had taught and the examples they had set. In this sense, people did achieve a kind of immortality, not as individual personalities, but as influences that rippled forward through time, shaping the thoughts and actions of those who came after them. He reflected on the nature of the soul, on what, if anything, survived death. The Stoics had various views on this. Some believed in a kind of temporary survival, with the soul eventually being reabsorbed into the universal reason. Others were more skeptical, thinking that death meant complete extinction of consciousness. Marcus seemed to hold both possibilities lightly, thinking that either way one should live the same kind of life, virtuously, rationally, in harmony with nature. What mattered wasn't securing some kind of personal immortality, but living well in the time given to you. If the soul survived in some form, well and good. If it didn't, if death meant complete cessation of consciousness, that was also acceptable. Either way, the task remained the same: to act with virtue, to fulfill one's duties, to treat others with justice and compassion. He also thought about the meaning of a good death, not a glorious death in battle, not a dramatic exit, but simply a natural end that came when it came, accepted with calm and dignity. He hoped, when his time came, to face it as he had faced all the challenges of his life, with equanimity, with acceptance, with the understanding that this too was part of nature's order, and not to be resisted or feared. In the evenings, writing by lamplight in his tent or quarters, Marcus poured these reflections into his personal notebooks. He wasn't writing for posterity. These were private notes, reminders to himself, tools for maintaining his philosophical practice. But through them, we can glimpse his inner life, can see how he worked through the universal human questions of meaning and mortality, purpose and death. And what he worked his way toward was a kind of serene acceptance. Life was brief, yes, but it could be lived fully. Death was inevitable, yes, but it need not be feared. What mattered was virtue, character, how one acted in the time one had. External circumstances were ultimately beyond control, but one's response to those circumstances was not. This was where freedom lay, not in controlling the world, but in controlling oneself, in maintaining one's integrity, regardless of what happened. As his health continued to decline, as he felt his energy waning and his body growing weaker, Marcus must have known that his time was drawing to a close. But there was still work to do. The frontier was more stable than it had been, but not yet secure. Commodus was not yet ready to rule alone. Arrangements had to be made, preparations completed. And so he continued, even as his body failed him, to fulfill his duties, to do what was required, to be faithful to his role and his responsibilities to the very end. Throughout all his years as emperor, particularly during the difficult campaigns on the Danube frontier, Marcus maintained a practice that would become his most enduring legacy. Writing private philosophical reflections, notes to himself about how to live well, reminders of Stoic principles, observations about human nature and the cosmos. These writings, which we now know as the Meditations, were never intended for publication. They were personal, intimate, a kind of ongoing conversation with himself about the challenges of life and how to meet them with virtue and wisdom. The Meditations is not a systematic philosophical treatise. It doesn't present arguments in careful logical order, doesn't develop a comprehensive worldview from first principles. Instead, it is a collection of thoughts, often repetitive, sometimes contradictory, always deeply personal. It is the record of a man trying to live his philosophy, trying to become better, trying to maintain his character in the face of enormous pressures and challenges. Reading the Meditations, we enter directly into Marcus's inner world. We see his struggles and his ideals, his doubts and his convictions. We see him reminding himself again and again of basic Stoic principles, that virtue is the only good, that external circumstances are neither good nor bad, that we should accept fate with grace, that we should treat others with patience and kindness, that we should focus on what is within our control and release what is not. The repetition in the Meditations is revealing. Marcus returns again and again to the same themes because he needed these reminders. He hadn't mastered these principles once and for all. He had to practice them daily, had to reinforce them constantly. The Meditations shows us that philosophical living is not a destination reached, but a practice maintained, not a problem solved, but a discipline continually exercised. In Book 1, Marcus lists the virtues he learned from various people in his life: his grandfather's good character and gentle spirit, his father's modesty and manliness, his mother's piety and generosity. He expresses gratitude for his teachers, for the philosophers who showed him what philosophy could be, for his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, who modeled how to rule with dignity and wisdom. This section is touching in its humility and gratitude, showing Marcus reflecting on how he became who he was, acknowledging his debts to others. In subsequent books, he develops various themes. One central concern is dealing with difficult people. How do you maintain your equilibrium when others are annoying, unjust, selfish, or cruel? Marcus's answer is to remember that such people are confused about what is truly good, that they act badly because they don't understand virtue. They are, in a sense, sick or ignorant, rather than evil. To become angry at them is like becoming angry at someone for having a fever. Better to pity them and try to correct them gently while maintaining your own inner peace. Another recurring theme is the brevity of life and the vastness of time. Marcus reminds himself that his life is just a tiny moment in cosmic history, that everything that exists will eventually cease to exist, that fame is meaningless because even the memory of the most famous eventually fades. This perspective helps him maintain proportionality in his reactions to events. If something won't matter in 100 years, why let it disturb you now? He also writes about death frequently, reminding himself that it is natural, that people have been dying since the beginning of time, that to fear death is irrational. Death is just a transformation, a dissolution of the elements that temporarily formed a person. Or perhaps it is a complete cessation of consciousness, in which case there is nothing to fear, because there will be no consciousness to experience anything. Either way, death is nothing to be avoided or dreaded. A key concept in the Meditations is the distinction between what is up to us and what is not. This distinction, central to Stoic philosophy, provides a way to achieve peace of mind. What is up to us? Our judgments, our choices, our character, our responses to events. What is not up to us? Other people's actions, the outcomes of events, whether we are healthy or sick, wealthy or poor, famous or forgotten. If we focus on what is up to us and release our attachment to what is not, we can achieve a kind of invincible serenity. Marcus also writes about duty and social obligation. We are not isolated individuals, but members of communities, family, city, empire, humanity, the cosmos itself. We have obligations to these communities, responsibilities that come from our social nature. To shirk these responsibilities is to betray our own nature. The philosophical life is not a life of withdrawal from society, but a life of engaged service, of fulfilling one's role in the community while maintaining inner freedom. Another theme is the exercise of attention and judgment. Marcus constantly reminds himself to examine his impressions, his automatic reactions to events. When something happens, we immediately form a judgment about it. It's good or bad, desirable or undesirable. But these judgments are often hasty and incorrect. By learning to pause, to examine these automatic judgments, we can avoid being jerked around by our knee-jerk reactions. We can choose how to respond rather than simply reacting. Throughout the Meditations, there is a strong sense of Marcus wrestling with himself, trying to overcome his natural tendencies toward anger, frustration, vanity, and distraction. He has to remind himself not to waste time gossiping or thinking about other people's business. He has to remind himself to focus on the present moment rather than worrying about the future or dwelling on the past. He has to remind himself that the obstacle is the way, that difficulties are opportunities to practice virtue. The writing style of the Meditations is often quite beautiful, with memorable phrases and striking images. Marcus speaks of time as a river carrying everything away, of human life as a brief dance between two eternities of non-existence, of the soul as a sphere maintaining its shape regardless of external pressures. These images aren't just literary flourishes, they are ways of understanding, tools for shifting perspective and maintaining philosophical wisdom. There is also a deep sense of cosmic perspective in the Meditations. Marcus sees himself as part of a vast universal order, a cosmos governed by reason and purpose. Whether this universal reason is what we call God, or simply the natural order of things, doesn't really matter. What matters is aligning oneself with it, accepting it, working in harmony with it, rather than struggling against it. This alignment with nature is, for Marcus, the essence of the philosophical life. Yet despite this cosmic perspective, Marcus never loses sight of concrete human concerns. He writes about dealing with difficult colleagues, about getting up in the morning when it's cold and you'd rather stay in bed, about people who don't appreciate what you do for them. These mundane concerns coexist with the loftiest philosophical reflections, showing that philosophy for Marcus wasn't an escape from ordinary life, but a way of engaging with it more effectively. Reading the Meditations today, nearly 2,000 years after it was written, we find that it still speaks to us. The specific circumstances of Marcus's life, the military campaigns, the imperial politics, the particular challenges of ruling in the 2nd century, are long gone. But the underlying human questions remain the same. How do we deal with difficult people? How do we face adversity without being broken by it? How do we maintain our integrity in challenging circumstances? How do we live with the knowledge of our mortality? How do we find meaning in a universe that doesn't obviously provide it? Marcus's answers to these questions, drawn from Stoic philosophy, but filtered through his own experience and expressed in his own words, continue to resonate. His emphasis on controlling what is within our control, on maintaining perspective, on treating others with patience and kindness, on doing our duty regardless of reward or recognition. These principles have proven to have enduring value. The Meditations also shows us something important about philosophical practice. Philosophy isn't just something you study in books or discuss in schools. It's something you live, something you practice daily, something you use to navigate the actual challenges of your actual life. Marcus didn't just understand Stoicism intellectually. He used it as a tool for living, applied it to real situations, tested it against hard circumstances. And the fact that his private notes were eventually preserved and published, becoming one of the most widely read philosophical works in history, is a kind of happy accident. Marcus would probably be surprised, and perhaps a bit embarrassed, to know that his personal reminders to himself would be read by millions of people across many centuries. But that accidental publication has given the world a precious gift, a window into the inner life of a wise and good person struggling to maintain their wisdom and goodness in difficult circumstances. The Meditations stands as testimony to the power of philosophy to sustain and guide us through life's challenges. It shows that it is possible to maintain one's character even in the most difficult circumstances, that power and wisdom can coexist, that the contemplative and active lives can be integrated. And it does all this not through grand claims or confident pronouncements, but through the humble example of a man trying his best, questioning himself constantly, reminding himself of what matters, and persisting in the effort to live well despite all obstacles. The 170s wore on, and Marcus, now in his late 50s, continued his work on the Danube frontier. The military situation had stabilized somewhat. The immediate threat of invasion had been pushed back. Treaties had been negotiated with various Germanic tribes, and the borders were more secure than they had been. But the cost of this stability had been enormous, measured not just in gold and resources, but in human lives and suffering. Marcus's health continued to decline. The years of campaigning in harsh conditions, the stress of constant responsibility, the toll of the plague he had survived, all of these had worn down his constitution. He tired more easily now, found physical activity more difficult. But his mind remained clear, and his commitment to duty remained unshaken. There was still work to be done, and he would continue doing it as long as he was able. His son Commodus was now in his late teens, and Marcus brought him more fully into the responsibilities of governance. Commodus accompanied his father on campaigns, attended council meetings, began to make decisions, and exercise authority. Marcus hoped that this practical experience would complete his son's education, would shape him into the kind of ruler Rome needed. But those who observed Commodus must have had concerns. The young man showed little interest in the philosophical principles that guided his father. He was drawn to spectacles and entertainment, to the pleasures that Marcus himself had always treated with indifference. He seemed to lack his father's seriousness of purpose, his commitment to duty, his deep sense of responsibility. But Marcus continued to work with him, continued to hope that maturity and responsibility would bring wisdom. The year 177 brought a mixture of success and sorrow. The military situation improved further, with more tribes accepting Roman terms and the frontier becoming increasingly stable. Marcus and Commodus returned to Rome for a triumph, a traditional Roman celebration of military victory. It was the first time Marcus had been back to the capital in years, and the city received him with genuine affection and respect. But even this moment of celebration was tinged with sadness. Marcus could see how Rome had changed during his long absence. The plague had taken a heavy toll on the population. The economy had been strained by the years of warfare. There was a sense of exhaustion, of resources depleted and energies spent. The golden age of peace and prosperity that had characterized the reigns of Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius was clearly over. Rome was still the dominant power in the Mediterranean world, but it was a dominance now maintained with greater effort and at higher cost. After the brief return to Rome, Marcus and Commodus went back to the frontier. There was still work to be done, still tribes to negotiate with, still borders to secure. Marcus knew that the Germanic pressure on Rome's northern frontier was not a temporary problem, but a long-term challenge that would persist for generations. The best he could do was establish a stable system that his successors could maintain and build upon. During these final years, Marcus's meditations takes on an even more reflective tone. He seems increasingly aware of his own mortality, increasingly focused on fundamental questions about life's meaning and purpose. He writes about legacy, about what, if anything, endures when we die. He concludes that what endures is not fame or memory. These fade quickly, but rather the effects of our actions, the ripples we create that spread out into the future in ways we can't predict or control. He also writes about acceptance, about the importance of embracing whatever fate brings, rather than resisting it. This had always been a Stoic principle, but now, facing his own death, it takes on immediate personal significance. He reminds himself that death is natural, that he shouldn't cling to life any more than he should rush toward death, that the wise person simply accepts the natural course of events. In 180, Marcus was campaigning along the Danube once again. The winter was harsh, and his health, already fragile, deteriorated further. He developed what was probably some form of infectious disease. Possibly plague, possibly something else. His strength failed rapidly. It became clear that he was dying. How did Marcus face his final days? We can imagine him in his quarters, perhaps in the military headquarters at Vindobona or another frontier post, surrounded by physicians and advisors, with Commodus nearby. His body was failing, but his mind remained clear. He had lived his whole life practicing for this moment, preparing for death through philosophical reflection and acceptance. Now that death had come, he was ready for it. There are stories, possibly apocryphal, about his final words and actions. Some say he asked that the golden statue of Fortune that stood in his room be taken to Commodus's room, saying, "Go to the rising sun. I am already setting." Others say he simply refused food and drink, accepting that his time had come. Whatever the exact details, all accounts agree that he faced death with calmness and dignity, without fear or resistance. On March 17th, 180, Marcus Aurelius died. He was 58 years old and had ruled for 19 years, nearly all of them spent dealing with crises, plague, war, economic problems, and administrative challenges. He had never had the peaceful reign he might have wished for, had never been able to simply be a philosopher, studying and teaching in quiet contemplation. Instead, fate had called him to serve in a different way, to be a philosopher-emperor, to apply his principles in the harsh world of political reality. His death was mourned throughout the empire. He was remembered for his justice, his wisdom, his tireless dedication to duty. The Senate deified him, as was customary for respected emperors, measured him officially one of the gods of Rome. But Marcus himself would have been indifferent to this honor. What mattered to him was not how he was remembered, but how he had lived, whether he had maintained his virtue, fulfilled his duties, treated others justly. Commodus succeeded him as emperor, and the fears of those who had observed his character proved well-founded. Commodus's reign would be remembered as one of the worst in Roman history, marked by cruelty, incompetence, and self-indulgence. The stability Marcus had worked so hard to maintain began to unravel. The Pax Romana, already strained, would eventually give way to a century of crisis and disorder. Should Marcus have recognized that Commodus was unsuited to rule? Should he have chosen a different successor, breaking the pattern of hereditary succession, but potentially finding someone more capable? These are questions historians still debate. But from Marcus's perspective, he did what he thought was right, preparing his son as best he could, maintaining the principle of dynastic succession that provided legitimacy and stability, hoping that Commodus would rise to the occasion when the full weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders. Marcus's death marked the end of what historians call the era of the 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. It was an era of relative peace, prosperity, and good governance, a period when the Roman Empire seemed to represent the pinnacle of human civilization. With Marcus's death, that era ended, and a more troubled time began. But if Marcus's political legacy was mixed, a stable empire handed to an unstable successor, his philosophical legacy was pure and enduring. His meditations, those private notes to himself, would survive. They would be copied and preserved, would eventually be printed and translated, would be read by countless people over the centuries, would inspire and guide generations of readers seeking wisdom about how to live well. And in those pages, Marcus lives on, not as the powerful emperor who commanded legions and ruled an empire, but as a thoughtful human being struggling with universal questions, trusting to maintain his character in difficult circumstances, practicing philosophy not as an abstract academic discipline, but as a practical guide for living. In the Meditations, we don't meet Marcus Aurelius, the emperor. We meet Marcus Aurelius, the human being, and in his humanity, we recognize our own struggles and aspirations. His life demonstrated that it was possible to hold power without being corrupted by it, to face suffering without being broken by it, to maintain one's humanity and integrity even in the most challenging circumstances. He showed that philosophy was not just for quiet scholars in peaceful academies, but could be practiced in the mud and blood of military camps, in the endless meetings of imperial administration, in the midst of plague and war and loss. And perhaps most importantly, he showed that the examined life, the philosophical life, was worth living, not because it guaranteed success or happiness or fame, but because it was the right way to live, because it aligned with human nature at its best, because it brought a kind of peace that external circumstances could never disturb. This was Marcus's great gift to posterity, not a perfect empire or a brilliant military victory, but an example of how to be fully human, fully alive, fully present to each moment while it lasts.